G'day guys, Chris Dorry here. Today I'm going to take you through my full Phantom draft. So this draft went up on ESPN earlier this morning and it includes every pick and every bid. So let's get started. So what I'm going to take you through. So in this draft, of course, as I've said, every pick, every bid, every club. That's what's in here. That's what I do every year. So this is just the national draft. So what we'll be seeing on Wednesday, we've got the first round. And of course on Thursday, we've got the rest of the national draft. And we can expect some trading. And look, for the purposes of this draft, I haven't included any actual trades just because we don't really know exactly, one, who is going to make the exchange, but also even if we did know the clubs. And as an example, I believe right away we're going to get a Bulldogs trade at pick 23 and the likely destination is Geelong. Well, which picks exactly will be exchanged? So if I was to do that, there would be that level of imprecision. And given this is a full draft, I'm not going to do that. So, but there will be some trades, no doubt, both within the first round, but there'll be a lot from the second round onwards. Just as there's players that will be of particular interests to clubs. So maybe there's someone who's slid a bit, so maybe a club wants to move up. Or conversely, there might be a team where maybe they want to move down the draft because they might still be able to get that player that they really like. So you've got that possibility also. Or alternatively, they might want to move some picks into next year's draft as well. So you've got a combination of those factors in play. Right?
Too bold.
But to take you through the draft, so pick 1, North Melbourne, Jason Horne-Francis. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. He's going pick 1 to North Melbourne this year. Lock it in. And of course, if you want to read more about it, well, again, as I've said, espn.com.au/AFL. You can see not only my full Phantom draft, but you can also find whether it's my power rankings with detailed profiles with some of my favourite players. And also during the year as well, I've been covering weekly games. So if you type in pretty much any of these players' names with Chris Dorry at the end or ESPN, I'm sure you'll find the vast majority of these players covered during the year. So pick 2. So this is, as we can see up here, a Greater Western Sydney pick. So what's going to happen? They're going to be bidding on Sam Darcy. So, and of course the Bulldogs will be matching this bid. And what they will have done, ultimately, they will have moved down from this pick 23 to some combination of whether it's later picks, possibly future picks, but we'll just have to see there. But ultimately the Dogs, they want more points and they might consider mechanisms, whether it's moving back into this year's draft or whatever the case may be. But basically, with pick 23, it's worth a lot of points under the points bidding system, so they really have no particular benefit of holding it because ultimately that pick will be of more value to another team than it will the Dogs. So they can easily just swing a trade where they can get a greater points valuation, meaning they would ultimately have a higher pick. So that's basically what will happen there. But Greater Western Sydney, they need more key position players and good ones. So they'll be bidding on Darcy, who I believe is number 1 on their draft board, if my understanding is correct. So Greater Western Sydney. So pick 3, I don't believe they're going to be placing a bid for Nick Dacos, but I believe they'll be picking Finn Callaghan. So you could say he's someone where he'll just fit into that midfield quite easily, where he's someone really contrasting, where GWS, of course, they've got a lot of those strong ball-winning mids. Well, with a Callaghan, you've got, although he's tall, he's really an incredible mover, and he's actually probably lacking that contested side. So he'd be more in there as that almost receiver. So that'd definitely work. And among the picks below, we've really got a number of teams that would love to get up to Greater Western Sydney's pick, but they're not going to trade it ultimately. It would take an absolute godfather trade that isn't, at least currently as we speak, on the table to my knowledge. So can't see that happening. He'll be pick 3, Greater Western Sydney. And then pick 4. So this is basically, as I've got here, Gold Coast pick 3. Well, what are they going to do? I believe they're going to be placing a bid on Nick Dacos. And it's a pretty obvious one here where, look, for me, he's just a 1B really behind a Jason Horne-Francis. So Collingwood fans should be stoked with this. So, and again, it's quite likely that Collingwood will be making a trade, a bit like with the Bulldogs, where they'll be moving out of pick 23. I'd be wagering that Collingwood will be moving out of whether it's 36, 38, one or both potentially, and moving back into next year's draft and possibly even moving back into this year's draft if there's a particular target that represents strong value at a particular point. So there's some things to be looking out for with Collingwood, and I'm sure already they're pretty organised with what they're going to be doing there. But Nick Dacos, of course, terrific midfield addition, but he'd be someone where Collingwood will, in the future at least, need to be really surrounding him with that sort of strong-bodied ball-winning mid, ultimately, because he is that sort of lighter-framed type. And he's not that, although he can win his own ball, you really want that big body with him, just as that complement. But who are Gold Coast ultimately going to be taking home? I believe it's Mac Andrew, and that looks highly likely. So we've got here Melbourne Next Gen Academy. So for a bit of an explanation behind that, well, of course, with the Next Gen Academy players, well, this year the rule is if it's a bid within the top 20, you can't match them at all. So there'll be no Jamara stories like there was last year with pick one. Oh, the Dogs can match that. Not happening this year. So our premiers unfortunately miss out on a really fantastic talent ultimately at the end of the day, who they would have loved to have had, but yeah, it doesn't happen, and Gold Coast capitalise and get their man. So Adelaide Pick 6 it will end up being. So of course here it's pick 4, but after bidding it becomes pick 6. So with a Rochelle, I think he's most likely Adelaide's target. Can't lock it in, but 90% sure I'd say it's Rochelle ultimately. So, and Adelaide are also exploring a move back a few picks. They aren't expected to move back many if indeed they do, but it is something they're considering. So if they can still get Rochelle, assuming he's even their preferred target, that would be the sort of thing that they would be considering here. So yeah, that's something to certainly keep an eye out for, but whether it's going to happen, I can't confirm. We'll have to find out on draft night, or maybe tomorrow we might find out a bit more information there as to what Adelaide might have in mind, and if they are moving back, how far, and what they would be gaining, I guess, for doing so, and for helping out another club to move up maybe a couple of spots, maybe 2-3 spots. So Hawthorne pick 7. So again, this would have been pick 5, but again, with bidding, it's pick 7. So we've got Josh Ward. So Hawthorne will be weighing up a few different players here, but for me, it's probably Ward. So I think it's really their midfield that's quite a weak point, and they really need someone who, I guess, just isn't really a plotter. Hawthorne really needs someone who can do a few more things, bring some skills, can add a bit of variety, add a bit of class, and Ward can do all that, but he's also got the ball winning as well as a bonus. So he's that really all-round immediate midfielder, ultimately. That's what you're looking at there. But there'll be a few others in the mix. So if I'm to move down a few spots, maybe it's a Matthew Johnson potentially. We'll have to see who else could be in that mix. But they're probably the ones that I would imagine would be most likely. Perhaps a Gibcus could be considered, but I don't believe Hawthorne will go tall. I think they'll go with the very best midfielder available, ultimately, at the end of the day. So you've got Fremantle pick 8. So Fremantle I found quite a hard team to place, in that there are quite a few players here that I associate with them and I think they would really consider. So I've gone with the key forward in JMS, and we'll have to see if it plays out that way. So obviously Fremantle, that's what they're really looking for. So it really depends on whether Fremantle really see a miss as that, I guess, number one option inside 50. So yeah, obviously he's that more sort of leading style target, I suppose you could say. So whether he's going to be necessarily that dominant contested marking type, I'm not too sure. But certainly in terms of on the lead, fantastic, converts his shots on goal. So he'd be an asset, no doubt, if added here. But there are a few others that I considered. So Ben Hobbs, who I'm picking goes to Richmond at this stage, unless there's someone else who slides, is probably the way I'm thinking. Perhaps they could consider a Josh Gibcus as a key defender, given the Asprey retirement, but I'm putting my money on Hobbs just because their midfield really looks exposed, and given they're still in that sort of, you could say, almost premiership window, I think they'd want someone a bit more immediate. So a Hobbs really fits that bill for me. And also, they really like that sort of genuine ball winner, that really strong guy around the contest. With Cochin nearing the end, look, Richmond really need that ultimately. But a Fremantle here at 8, they could consider a Hobbs. So there might be a bit of mind games there, but Hobbs could also drop a little bit further as well. He's not guaranteed to go this high. There'll be a few clubs considering him. So Fremantle here, I've gone Matthew Johnson as a local midfielder, so tall midfielder. That'll certainly help with the likes of whether it's David Mundy, Nat Fyfe, sort of in the latter parts of their career. And with a Johnson, there's a few clubs as well above him that would be certainly giving him due consideration. So Yeah, that's certainly one to look out for, but there's certainly others in the mix. I'd be saying someone like a Neil Erasmus, well, he could certainly be in the mix, who I've got a few picks later. And also a Nasiah Wanganeen-Milera, I gave strong consideration to as well with that pick. So with Fremantle, they could possibly do with someone else more who's pretty handy on the outside. So maybe here's another who could be considered, though I haven't heard too much sort of linking sort of there. So yeah, I've got pick 11 St Kilda, Josh Gibcus. So best key defender in the draft, many would say. For me, probably not quite that number one on quality, but in terms of the perception of the recruiters, they're all pretty much in consensus in believing it's Gibcus. And St Kilda, of course, they really need a key defender. If there's a particularly good midfielder available, they would certainly be giving that strong consideration too. But with St Kilda, one thing I've noticed over the years is that they tend to stray really towards the local Victorian talent. So you could have someone like, say, a Neil Erasmus available, maybe it's a Nasiah Wanganeen-Milera, or perhaps maybe a Matthew Johnson drops to that pick. So if that's the case, I would be thinking that even then, a St Kilda would be slightly leaning towards a local talent. So maybe if a Hobbs is available, although he's not necessarily the best list fit, or maybe it's a Josh Ward, I think they're the sorts that St Kilda would be more so looking after, I think, or looking out for. They really like their local talents, ultimately, if you really dig deep in their draft history. So West Coast pick 12, Neil Erasmus. So he's someone where he almost qualified actually as an NGA for West Coast, funnily enough. So they've certainly been keeping their eye out for him. And West Coast also like their local talents, if you look at them. So, and their draft history. So, yeah, I think Erasmus would be a good shot, assuming he's available. And if he goes a bit earlier and a Matthew Johnson is available, I think he'd be a really good chance as well. But ultimately, West Coast, they've got an aging midfield. They need some good youth through there. So I think they'll be prioritising that, highly likely. And look, maybe you've got maybe a Ben Hobbs could slip through depending on what happens with the order. Maybe he could be another considered, but I think Erasmus is probably a pretty good shot there. And also I'd say maybe even a Josh Sin would make sense. So another drafting tendency with West Coast I've found over the years has been they really like guys who, not just in their draft years, but really the years before their draft year have been really fantastic. So with someone like a Sin, really from those younger age groups, he's really been considered one of the very top prospects in this year's draft. So, and whether he's seen as a midfielder, a rebounding halfback, some might have different opinions there. Here's someone where certainly with either vision in mind, he could also be a fit for a West Coast. So there's a few I could consider in the mix, but for me, it's Erasmus at this stage. So Essendon pick 13, Nasiah Wanganeen-Milera. So there's the potential that a Wanganeen-Milera could be picked a bit earlier. So we do have to watch out for that possibility. But if he's available for Essendon at this pick, I think he really offers something that's a bit unique for Essendon and something they don't really have much of. So in terms of pure outside players, Essendon for me are probably a bit on the thin side. So I think a Wanganeen-Milera would make a lot of sense here, ultimately, if he were to slide here. But look, if he's not available and there's some other combination of players, look, I think Essendon probably go the best available route. And of those available, look, maybe they could consider Sin. I'd be thinking about probably Josh Goder as well, who happens to be one where I have him sliding a bit more compared to where I sort of thought maybe a few weeks ago maybe he might have landed. So there's some sort of updated thoughts there. But yeah, I think probably a Wanganeen-Milera to Essendon. And then 14 Port Adelaide, I've gone Josh Sin. So I mentioned him before. Look, maybe he goes a bit earlier. Maybe he drops a few places. Whether he's Port Adelaide's most pressing need, we'll have to wait and see. But there are clubs that will be looking at him as a midfielder. And with sort of his speed, acceleration, yeah, some clubs might be enticed by that. So we'll have to wait and see there. But yeah, Port Adelaide, look, if Sin has already been taken or if there's another notable slider, I'm sure they'd love a Wanganeen-Milera, being a South Australian, that outside talent, something a bit different for their list. So there'll be a few others. Neil Erasmus, if he got through, again, similar story. I think he'd be one where Port Adelaide would be looking to pick him up in a hurry, to say the least. And same with a lot of these other guys as well. Maybe it's a Johnson, possibly even a Hobbs, just given they sort of have that older midfield, might like to introduce a bit more youth through there. But yeah, Greater Western Sydney. So I've gone Blake Howes. So this is almost one to satisfy Finn Callaghan a bit, where they're mates. They both come from Sandy. So yeah, you've got that sort of potential there. But with Howes, look, is something a little bit different for Greater Western Sydney as well, where they've got a heap of midfielders. Howes is someone where, whether you're playing him on a flank, whether it's on a wing, he's got great sort of athleticism firstly, but then strong mark as well. So yeah, look, something a bit different, and it would be interesting if picked here to see what the development vision would be, but he's someone where he's firmly in the first round mix. So although I don't necessarily rate him, say, a top 20 or even a top 30 pick on quality based on what I've seen, but of course the season was cut short, so he could well have moved up my board with more games. But yeah, it's just one of those where I believe he's probably going first round, or if not, it's pretty early in the second round. There's quite a few clubs sort of late first that do have genuine interest in Howes. So do watch out for that. Brisbane pick 16, so I've gone Darcy Wilmot. So of course Brisbane need quite a lot of help in defence. Their defence is looking quite thin. But what sort of makes me match a Wilmot with a Brisbane specifically is they've got a tendency towards liking guys with late year birthdays. So I think that's a point that really can't be overlooked. So you've got that sort of element that sort of ties in as well as fitting their needs. So that's one where I made that connection really on that basis. And I've made that connection for quite some time now. So we'll have to see how that goes and whether it works out that way. But I think he'd be firmly in the mix by this point. And also I'd say from around sort of, you could say pick 15 onwards, look, the draft does open up quite a bit. So from here, for me at least, there's quite a bit of guesswork. I can't speak for others who have created their own phantom drafts, but for me from this point onwards, I'm really not sure who is going where. With the other picks, I've got a pretty good idea of who would be sort of really firmly in the mix and who would be those sort of one or two most highly in consideration. But from here, look, you never know. And this is where, with a lot of draft boards, you'll really get a lot of picks that just won't go sort of to script necessarily. So they're things to most certainly be aware of. But Richmond pick 17, Jacob Van Rooyen. So Richmond, look, they've got some aging key position players, and they've also had Asprey retire. So I think by this point, look, if Van Rooyen's still on the board, I think unless they go with, say, a Gibcus earlier, I think they probably go with a Van Rooyen here. So just being that's probably a bit thin in defence, a bit thin up forward in terms of youth, where, of course, you've got Rewalt, maybe he's got one more year left in him. You've got Lynch, where, look, he's drawing to 30, so you really want that, I guess, succession plan and those younger guys to start coming through, ultimately, in Richmond's situation. So for me, that's just a logical pick there without necessarily anything too concrete in terms of the rumour mill. And for Sydney here, so of course with the departure of Dawson, look, I think someone like a Brown would make a bit of sense. And look, maybe with a Braden Campbell, I think he has a breakout season looming, and with a Dawson leaving, maybe that really puts him in the spotlight more and allows him to play a more prominent role. But I do think that Sydney will be getting the midfield pieces through the draft and be able to find those sort of other players as well through other means. So whether it's later down the track getting a Paddy McCartan as an additional key position player, and yeah, I think Sydney will be pretty well right with their other needs. But sort of in this range, if you look through all the other types, you've sort of got a lot of others where they're more sort of your outside-ish types, rebounding halfbacks, got sort of a crumbing forward, skilled mid, got a big-bodied mid here, so maybe a Nevitt could be possible, but you've got a lot of types that, I don't know, it's a lot of sort of guys where a lot of the clubs will be perceiving the value to be in sort of the rebounding halfbacks at this stage. So although I might not necessarily have a Brown as a top 20 talent, the perception in clubland is that there's quite a lot of value in terms of those sort of rebounders at this point in the draft. So there'll be quite a few dropping around this point, I would be certainly imagining. So number 19, Melbourne. So Campbell Chesser. So, and with Melbourne, look, they're probably lacking a bit of class, a bit of run on the outside. So it's just one of those where it's just a simple list fit, and this is the rough range I'm expecting a Chesser to fit into. So he could possibly go a few picks earlier, or he could go a few picks later, ultimately. So we'll have to see how that goes there. And with a Goda, so he could possibly go quite a way earlier. The Western Australian clubs have expressed interest, so they could possibly even jump early on him there. Or alternatively, if he drops even further, maybe he drops to, maybe it's a Fremantle at 21, and then he'd represent great value there. So, but it's probably hard to see him really dropping past this Fremantle pick, would be my instinct with a Gota. So, yeah, with a Brisbane, I think that's good value. And again, with a Gota, he gives you the opportunity where whether you want to use him as a midfielder, he's got the possible scope to develop there. But otherwise, he's a really good rebounding defender who can intercept, generate a bit of drive with his runs. So there's certainly some options there, and it just gives Brisbane a little bit of flexibility with how they want to approach things. And it sort of fills those list needs pretty seamlessly there. But yeah, certainly there'll be some trade activity sort of in this latter part of the first round, I'm imagining. Who's going to move? We'll have to wait and see, but there'll be clubs really wanting to move up and others wanting to move down. So we'll have to really see, I guess, what opportunities arise for particular teams and who really is motivated enough to possibly even in some instances pay overs to move up a little bit. So that's certainly something to note there. But Port Adelaide, look, maybe if pick 14 works out this way, maybe they're not too satisfied with that. So maybe they want to move back. That might be a potential opportunity. Yeah, so we'll have to see with a few of these clubs who moves, and if so, where do they move and how far. But the second round, this is where there's going to be a lot of movement. So watch this space. So 21, I've gone Corey Warner. So brother of Chad. So obviously from Sydney, but the difference is you've got a more skilled player. Well, maybe not more skilled, but I'd say more outside. So he's not as strong on the inside, but it's more his run that's particularly good. But he can generate a bit more drive by foot as well, I'd be saying of a Warner here. And look again with Fremantle, the way I've worked the picks, I've gone with basically a key forward. That's one of their needs. I've gone with a tall midfielder. So that helps there. But then really Fremantle, I believe, really probably want that outside type. So if a Chesser makes it through here, maybe he's the pick. But for the purposes of this Phantom draft, I've gone with Warner, who I believe Fremantle have some interest in. So we'll have to watch that. But and look, even Sydney, maybe a bit before this, might even have a little bit of interest there too. But if Sydney and Fremantle pass, maybe he drops a little bit. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes. So number 22, North Melbourne. So Jesse Motlop. So, of course, he's the son of Daniel, as I've got in the profile here. And really is just a talented small forward. So he could be that role player for North Melbourne. They just really need that sort of pressure crummer just as a point of contrast. So I think a Jesse Motlop makes quite a lot of sense there. And then a Tyler Sonsie. So with what he did for Box Hill in the VFL, I think that would have really caught Hawthorne's eye. And again, he's one of those really contrasting players. So, look, he could be someone where he fits in the first round, certainly. And he was very highly regarded coming into the season. So maybe he could be considered by whether it's a Melbourne, so maybe a Melbourne at 19, or really anyone looking for a bit of a burst of speed, maybe a bit more skill. That's the sort of thing we're looking at with a Sonsie. So, has lacked some consistency, but yeah, look, I think Hawthorne would be pretty happy with him just because they've got really a bunch of, you could almost say, plotters through the midfield where they really need that point of contrast. Someone who can really provide a bit of a burst of speed, introduce some skill to that group. They just really need that injection of something a bit different. So Sonsie makes absolute sense for Hawthorne there. So Geelong Pic24. So I've gone with Mitch Nevitt. And look, there's quite a number at this stage that could be in consideration for a number of these picks. If let's say a Tom Brown, so from Sydney's pick, if he drops here, he'd be certainly in the mix. And look, if Geelong had the Bulldogs pick, so we have really Geelong at 22, which becomes 24, and we've got 23. If they could get the Nevitt-Brown combo, Geelong would be highly motivated by that, I believe. So I think they'd be going to the draft and almost seeing that as a best case scenario. So particularly with, I guess, that first pick and what could become their second pick, ultimately, if that trade goes down. So that's certainly a storyline to watch there. And of course, Brown, his father, did play a few games, or he played quite a number of games for Geelong, but didn't play the 100 to qualify for father-son. And also, I should say of Motlop, so we've got he's a Freo Next Gen Academy, but because he's part of the WA, he's a Metro Indigenous talent, so being part of that sort of Metro region, he would require a top four, any picks inside the top 40. Fremantle are unable to match, so a bid would have to come outside that 40. So pick 41 onwards, Fremantle would be fine to match. So. And look, it's quite possible as well at this pick 21 that they just take him there, knowing that he won't be available at their later picks. So that's something else to watch for. And Fremantle as well could certainly do with a good small forward. So again, something else to watch for. But yeah, with a Mitch Nevitt, look, Geelong just need that help through the midfield. They need good young midfielders. And Nevitt here represents value. And being a local talent, I think they're really going to be drawn to him in a hurry. So I think he's probably their preference at this pick, ultimately. And then Hawthorne at 25, so they put a bit of work into Sam Butler. So I think he's another, along with Sonsie, where if available, I think he's really going to be someone Hawthorne will be very, very keen to secure at this point. So yeah, definitely a name to watch. And look, he can play that sort of mid-forward. He's the brother of Dan Butler. So, but probably a bit more of a midfielder version at this stage is probably the relative difference, and a few centimetres taller as well. But otherwise, he can do a lot of the same sort of things. So you've got an exciting player there, ultimately. Carlton at 26. So this is actually going to be Carlton's only pick in the draft. So it might look weird seeing Carlton only have one pick, because the rule is that you are required to have 3 list spots available and to take 3 players ultimately. But that 3 players can include rookie upgrades, of which Carlton have upgraded 2 rookies. So yeah, unfortunately for Carlton, they've only really got that one pick. What they might consider doing is moving back potentially in the draft a little bit. So that's been spoken about as something that could possibly happen as well, if they believe there's going to be someone they'd really like there. So we'll have to wait and see, and maybe that moves them up a little bit next year. So unfortunately for Carlton fans, your involvement will be fairly limited. But if an Arlo Draper is available at 26, I think he represents really good value. I'm not necessarily making a Draper to Carlton connection, but what I am saying here is that a Draper would be a really good addition to Carlton's midfield, where ultimately it's a part of the ground that's been weak for quite a long time. And they'd really be thinking if they can get Draper, great value, and they can potentially improve that midfield. So they might not be as motivated if that level of slider makes it to that pick. So something to watch there. And then here I've got a bit more bidding happening. So we're going to have a few more picks moving down. So we've got Greater Western Sydney, so they'll be matching bids on Josh Fay at this stage. So this is, of course, Richmond bidding. And so I think they might be one of the troublemakers here. But yeah, I think Josh Fay is a rebounding defender. And look, Greater Western Sydney, they're going to match. And the bid won't be happening before their pick 13. So they're the things for Greater Western Sydney fans to be aware of. And you're really fortunate to be getting really quite a talented rebounding defender at this point. So, and again, I think Richmond will be placing another bid, and I believe Mitch Owens would be a good chance around this point. So I don't see why Richmond don't just bid on these academy guys first up. And ultimately, the other advantage of doing so as well is they've got this concentration of picks. So they have what would become essentially 29, 30, and 31. So maybe they do some moves. Maybe they do some sort of move that moves them up in next year's draft, because maybe there's a club that's particularly keen to get into this range to get one of these sliders. Because in this draft, one of the dynamics is there's an incredible amount of value in the second round in this draft. So that's something that is really important to be aware of. So yeah, Mitch Owens. So there is the risk that he is bid on late in the first round. So there are a few clubs in that range that are interested, but the belief is that he gets through to the second round and that a bid will be placed there, meaning that as a Next Gen Academy prospect, being something after 20, St Kilda can match, no problems. So, and they'll be over the moon to, of course, get Mitch Owens here. He's a really good get for them, for me, as a top 20 talent in this draft on quality. So Richmond at 29. So again, I'm not projecting, well, there's probably a good likelihood, honestly, that at least one of these 3 picks for Richmond move hands. So that is something to watch out for. But again, I'm assuming all these picks are taken as they stand today. So Richmond, I think a Rhett Bazzo as a key defender would make sense. So Van Rooyen, look, he could play forward or back. Given he's mostly played forward, I think probably Richmond draft him thinking he's going to be a key forward, and then they get Rep Bazzo as the key defender, ultimately, if the draft works out this way, and if Richmond go for that midfielder first. So, and Bazzo, most likely he's available here, so I don't see any particular need for Richmond to, at least in my view, reach to get Gibcus as high as their first pick. So I think they can do quite reasonably with a Bazzo at this point here. So just really good interceptor ultimately. And then moving on, so pick 20, Richmond, Zach Taylor. So I think there's a few similar types that Richmond would be considering here. One that I gave actually quite strong consideration to was Jake Saligo. So I think he could possibly go a little bit earlier than I've got him, but ultimately he'd be another where he's in this sort of mix as one of those sort of talented smaller midfielders. And Richmond don't really have an aversion to going a little bit smaller, so I think someone like that would be a pretty good chance to feature around this point. And there are a few clubs sort of almost in the first round. I believe there's been a little bit of interest from Sydney, so maybe if they move down, maybe they get a Taylor. But yeah, I think probably Taylor's otherwise, other than that sort of scenario, probably a second rounder. So, and good value here. He's played some really good football this year, ultimately, is Zach Taylor. And then Richmond at 31, I've gone Judson Clark. So he's played really as a forward, he's a speedy forward, but I'd even consider putting him behind the ball. So you've got a lot of optionality with him. He's got the talent, where he's got the speed, he's got the skills, so he's got game, basically. So again, he's one where in this range, he's a good get who there'll be a few teams probably that would like to move into this range to get one of these sorts of guys, whether it's a Clark or whoever the case may be. So, and again, he could go a few picks earlier. He could go in the 20s quite reasonably, or he could even go late in the first round if a team was really very keen on him. So there are those chances also. So West Coast at 32. So I haven't heard any particular links with this one, but in assessing what West Coast have in terms of rucks, they're pretty thin. And with Nick Nat he'd be 31 now. So yeah, look, West Coast really probably do need to look at that ruck succession plan. And with Conway, he's the best pure ruck in this draft. So he's one that makes sense. And look, with West Coast already getting a midfielder earlier, and they can always take another one later, well, I think a Conway makes quite a bit of sense around here. So next up, so Lee Collier to Geelong. So it fills their key defence need ultimately. So, and look, they might consider maybe bringing back a Blake Slenslog with whether it's a later pick, rookie pick. Geelong certainly will be giving consideration to that. But if they want to really address it here and now and secure their guy, I think Lee Collier is the guy. And look, West Coast, they've shown some interest in Lee Collier, so he could be picked there. And also the clubs above could be genuine considerations. Maybe a Richmond who, again, they might want to be a competitive team next year. So maybe they look at Lee Collier given he's those couple of years older. Or perhaps whether it's a Carlton where they're looking pretty thin, of course, now with the retirement of Liam Jones. So could they consider him potentially? So you've got quite a few clubs needing those key defenders around this range. So Lee Collier could possibly come into consideration. So, but I like him at Geelong. And the other thing I'd say with Geelong as well is they really like their mature ages and they've had incredible success picking them. So whether it's a Tim Kelly, whether it's a Tom Stewart, whether it's a Harry Taylor going back in the day, James Podsiadly as a rookie, just they're getting incredible players as mature ages and they're really securing fantastic value. And for me, Lee Collier is one of the potential value picks just based on his rate of development, how good he is of an interceptor in defence, he can shut down players as well. So yeah, certainly one to watch. And Sydney, if Lee Collier makes it past Geelong, well, I think Sydney would be really interested at this point as well. So, and look, in this draft, I haven't given Sydney any mature ages. It's just happened that at their particular picks, there hasn't been one that sort of really screamed the right sort of level of value, I suppose. But yeah, with Paddy McCartan sort of coming down the road, well, look, maybe Sydney consider that to be enough. We'll have to see, but there is definitely the possibility, and I'll flag it here and now, that Sydney do take a key defender, and it could well be mature ager. Maybe it's a Charlie Dean, to give you another name, who could potentially be in the mix as early as here, though maybe he goes a little bit later, so we'll have to see. But here's another where he's a couple of years older. But yeah, Jake Saligo. So at this point, Saligo would be considered a value get. So yeah, just good midfielder. Maybe some might think maybe he could play a little bit forward, so we'll have to see how that vision is. But yeah, certainly there's quite a lot of interest, and maybe even as high as first round, incredibly, which I certainly wouldn't have picked a few months ago. And then Angus Sheldrick. So Geelong have expressed quite a bit of interest in Sheldrick, and look, the way he closed the season, he's a baller. Like relegating Horne-Francis to basically being a forward after really stopping him from having any run at the ball or winning the ball through the midfield in that under-18 champs game. Sheldrick can really play. So just one of the hardest, toughest ball winners in the draft. Really like his game. If he goes 30 plus, he's representing value. So he really comes into the equation, probably second round, but I think he's going to be one of those real value guys in the future. So this is a name to certainly circle for those who are looking for maybe some potential bargains down the road. So here, I've gone Adelaide bidding on Marcus Windhager. So it's basically looking at Adelaide's midfield. Look, they don't really have the speed. They need that injection of something a bit more exciting. So I've gone with a bid on Windhager here. So some might think maybe there's a bid coming a bit earlier. It's possible a bid comes a bit later, but I think this is probably around where there'll be that sort of interest in potentially a bid. So yeah, that's certainly something to watch there. And then I've gone James Willis to Adelaide at 37. So haven't heard anything concrete or specific, but he's just one of those where he just makes sense for their list as that sort of goal-kicking midfielder, really has that power and really has that acceleration. So yeah, just would give Adelaide that something a little bit different just to sort of spice things up through mostly the middle. But look, he can go forward. You can do any number of things with him. But yeah, he's one of those good midfielders where he can actually rack it up and still have that sort of explosive impact as well. So at this point, maybe he could be a value pick. We have to see. But he's certainly got some attributes where I think he'll excite some recruiters around this point. And talking about excitement machines, Alistair Lorde. So for me, he's the best rebounder in the draft, honestly, for me. Just in terms of that run, what he can do by foot is fantastic. So really like him, and sort of in this late second round onwards sort of part of the draft, I think this is where he comes into the mix. But yeah, I think potentially a good get here. And giving West Coast their key defender. So look, they've shown interest in Lee Kalir. Don't know if they'll have the same interest in Charlie Dean, but look, given they missed out a little bit earlier, I've given them Charlie Dean as that key defender. So just with West Coast, I really look at them as quite thin in defence. And if you consider the lack of durability of their options in defence, I really think they almost have to go the mature age route just to get that someone really ready to go. Where if you look at a Tom Barrass, he's never played 20 games in a season, ever. And then you've got a Jeremy McGovern where, look, he can have injuries as well. He's not perfectly durable, and yeah, he'll be turning 30 next year. So look, a West Coast really probably do need an additional extra sort of key defender to have ready to go. And with the Charlie Dean as well, I think he makes a bit more sense where defensively he's very sound. He can intercept a little bit as well, clean ball user. But yeah, he doesn't have to be that number one interceptor. So I think a Charlie Dean possibly works quite well for West Coast if they do go that route. So we'll have to see there. And then moving on to Melbourne. So I'll scroll this down in a moment. But with Melbourne, a Jack Williams, if he makes it to this pick, I think is probably a sort of pretty probable type, where Melbourne really don't have that impressive of a young key position group. So with a Williams, maybe he's looked at as a key forward, possibly even with the vision to become a key defender. So, but he's mostly played as a key forward. So just really that strong bodied. You can see it with the 95 kilos. He just pushes guys around a bit like that Tom Hawkins almost, where if he engages in a ruck contest inside 50, he'll push you aside, grab it from the ruck, have a shot at goal. So he's got that sort of strength, but probably not necessarily the athleticism. So we'll have to see how he develops, but he's still sort of on that younger side. So yeah, he could be a possible shot there for Melbourne and represent value to some at least around this stage, given there aren't really many key position players. And I think Williams is one where I think a club probably in the top 40 goes for him, or if not, it probably won't be much later. And one other thing I should mention as well, in this draft, I've gone with very much a minimalist model. So what I mean by that is I believe clubs will be taking pretty much, unless there's someone who represents spectacular value in their mind, and look, I'm not in the minds of recruiters. I don't know exactly the precise players they'll be seeing that exceptional value in. But I do believe clubs will really be wanting to take picks to whether it's the preseason supplemental period, whether it's taking picks to the mid-season draft, just having those list spots available in case there's someone who really represents incredible value at that time, who becomes that obvious option and could be a sort of, I guess, best 22 guy. So I do believe clubs will really be sort of going that, again, sort of minimalist route, and then maybe taking a few more rookies potentially instead of really going into the national draft. So that's something else I also want to mention. And of course here, so we've got a Collingwood pick, we've got a few Bulldogs picks, some more Collingwood picks. Really, all these picks have really just been used up by matching bids. So, and look, that's the thing that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily appreciate with the draft. They'll think, oh, gee, Collingwood have got lucky getting Dacos, or, oh, gee, Bulldogs have got lucky getting Sam Darcy. Well, the problem when you're matching those sort of early bids, because with the father-sons, you're only getting that 20% discount, well, you're giving up so much in terms of all these picks. You're really handicapping yourself, firstly in terms of draft flexibility, but even to a greater extent, I should add, also in terms of that trade flexibility as well, where it really makes it hard, whether it's trading during the trade period. It really limits, I guess, what you have to do, and you have to plan so precisely just to make sure you've got those points to match your players. And of course, things can get unstuck like it did last year for Collingwood, where they traded their 2021 first, and of course it's gone to GWS, and GWS took advantage because they noticed Treloar's gone, Stevenson gone, Phillips gone. There's the opportunity that maybe Collingwood drop off and they're not going to be that top 8 team, and they were on the money. So, and Collingwood, of course, well, they had to really sort of move that pick to ensure they could match bids on Reef McGuinness. So there are really quite a lot of problems that don't get spoken about enough in terms of whether it's matching bids on the father-sons, the academies, next-gen academies. It really handicaps you. So you really do have to be sure that the player that I guess you're nominating, is that whether it's that father-son or whatever the case may be, really is worth that. And if you're matching bids, you really want to make sure they're going to be worth that. Otherwise, look, you can be doing some harm almost to yourself in some respects. So that's something for you guys at home I just want you to be mindful of, because it's something that really, in analysing things a bit more deeply, I've really come to notice and appreciate. So but yeah, Sydney here, so pick 41, Kyle Lohmann. So, and look, there's some talk that there's actually some second round interest, so maybe he goes a bit earlier. So we'll have to see on that. But yeah, talented, speedy forward. Here's another where I could make the argument, maybe you put him behind the ball just because he's really got that acceleration and he can take a grab as well. So strong contested mark. So you've got those sort of options there as well. But ultimately, I think a team will just be drafting him as a forward. That's what he's seen as, broadly speaking. And then we've got an Eamonn Wilkinson. So there's actually quite a few teams that have expressed interest in him, which is an interesting one. But yeah, it's basically that mature age pressure forward ultimately. So those few years older, just brings the pressure act, strong tackler, has a bit of speed, okay around goal. Didn't make my extended draft board, even though I did go quite mature age heavy, but it's just, I guess, not enough scoreboard impact for what I'd be hoping for a small forward. Plus, probably I'd like a bit more sort of in terms of finding the footy, maybe setting up teammates a little bit more, though is reasonable at that too. So, but yeah, look, with a Wilkinson, there's quite a bit of interest. So from 40 plus, I think there'll be quite a few teams looking for that small forward that could consider him. So Brisbane here, look, maybe they consider a small forward. They've added to their defence. Maybe they look for something a little bit contrasting. So that's why I plugged him in there, just because, look, Brisbane are in their window. They'd be open, given that, more likely than, say, a younger team to consider a mature ager, and looking for that boost up forward. Maybe a Wilkinson's considered, though they could just as easily, let's say, go for a midfielder or something else. So, but look, he's someone where from this range, he sort of comes into the picture. I'll say that much. So North Melbourne at 43. So I've gone Sam Banks. So Tasmanian, he's been good for a number of years now. So look, there'll be some clubs even in the second round giving him consideration, but basically that rebounding defender who can also sort of play on a wing and generate some drive. So North Melbourne, Brady Hough. So is sort of a bit of a utility. You can play him through the midfield. So have to wait and see. But again, there's quite a bit of draft interest here. So Certainly one to watch, and again around this range, I think it's probably where he lands. Lachlan Rankin. So what Collingwood have lacked in their front half, aside of course from a good key forward, my check's good, but they really need sort of another good key forward. But Lachlan Rankin, so really he's that sort of speedy, talented crumbing forward. He can really bring that, I guess, dimension that Collingwood have never had, where for so many years, the good smalls for Collingwood, they've all been really those marking smalls. So whether it's an Elliott or whoever the case may be, and same with those medium forwards as well, they've all been those marking forwards. So with a Rankin, look, he just brings a bit of talent and a bit of different talent to Collingwood's front half. So, and look, you can play him across the field as well. You can play him in defence if you want, maybe push him onto a wing potentially. But yeah, he's just got that, as I'd describe it, front half talent. So I think he's someone where maybe he'd be in the conversation for Collingwood. And look, they've got that Oakley link as well. So yeah, look, maybe that sort of comes into the picture as well. So Tajwa Waden, so I don't believe there'll be a bid that Melbourne will have to match. I think they just take him with their last pick, which I believe will be this pick here. So, but yeah, look, I've liked his play quite a bit in the waffle, and he has shown some signs. So although he's not on my draft board, he's actually someone where I think even compared to his teammates, so his teammates with Warner, I actually slightly prefer Woden, honestly. So he does have some talent, and look, he is worth Melbourne certainly nominating. Maybe I'd have picked him as a rookie instead, but yeah, I can't necessarily hate on him going here if he does. So because he does have some talent. So Essendon here at 49, Conor Mcdonald. So there's quite a bit of talk that Mcdonald will go quite a bit earlier than this. So a lot of people would be thinking he's a second rounder. There's been interest expressed by Carlton potentially. So if Carlton move back, I think that's more the scenario that they look at a Conor Mcdonald, because I don't think necessarily there'd be too much early interest, though I could very well be wrong. But yeah, look, with what I'm seeing with this year's dynamic is there's so many good midfielders that there's going to be guys that drop, and every year there's good midfielders that drop. So I think McDonald's possibly one of those that there's a good chance that he does drop into what after bidding will be the 40s. So yeah, certainly watch for that. But yeah, certainly good midfielder in those few games that I guess he's played, both NAB League and various other games. Yeah, look, he's been a pretty good performer, just racks it up. So yeah, he's a good piece. So it could be a good midfielder for a club looking for another good midfielder ultimately. So Cooper Merley, I've described him as a goal-kicking midfielder here. But yeah, just adds a bit more spark ultimately for a team. So Adelaide have expressed interest. There's a few other teams that might be sniffing around sort of in the latter part of the draft. So you could say 40 plus. So yeah, he's certainly one to look out for sort of in that range if looking for that type. Collingwood at 49, Felix Flockhart as a ruckman, so he can also play a little bit forward as well. But yeah, with Max Lynch obviously leaving Collingwood, I believe that there's a good chance that they'll be seeking another ruck as well to boost their stocks. So you've got Mason Cox, who Collingwood have never really played as a ruck, and then you've got otherwise really Darcy Cameron as that other option. So they're so thin through the ruck that I think a Flockhart is a good chance, even if he is a bit of a risk. So he's a couple of years older, so if he's not 20, well, he turns 20 this year. I don't know his date of birth top of mind, but yeah, he's a 20-year-old. But yeah, just a good athlete ultimately. So he's one where you're speculating that he'll develop physically and that he'll develop really his game more broadly. So he's a bit raw, a bit of a project. Needs to develop his ground ball stuff. Obviously needs to get quite a lot stronger if he wants to become a ruck. So yeah, look, maybe Collingwood would consider him as a development project, just to have someone sort of down the pipeline coming through. Maybe Grundy asks for a trade in the future, who knows? So yeah, I think Collingwood would probably go for that depth option. And look, he can play a little bit forward too, so that might appeal also, but have to see how that goes there. Hawthorne at 50, so Paul Curtis. So look, he's not really a ball winner, but he can take a grab. So strong on the lead, he's a good forward. So yeah, look, just giving Hawthorne something a little bit different. They need a bit of a boost up forward as well. You've got Gunston aging, you've got Bruce aging, so they're in the latter parts of their career ultimately. We don't even know what Gunston's health is going to look like. So yeah, look, Hawthorne do need to start rejuvenating their front half a little bit with some more good talent. So I think a Curtis would come into the picture really from that, maybe even sort of 35-ish onwards. There'll be a few clubs sniffing around, so I think it's a good chance to go. Greg Clark. So both WA clubs, I believe, have some level of interest. So yeah, look, West Coast could potentially take him as one of their midfielders, but I think Fremantle could be a chance to consider him here again, just as that sort of, I guess, capable midfielder with a bit more sort of maturity to his game. So again, with Mundy in those later stages, Fife sort of having some question marks around his health and whether he can sort of fully come back, maybe a Clark is considered. Very different type. He's really a defensive midfielder. I wouldn't even call him an inside midfielder. Look, he's that sort of taller type, but he has played more of his footy on the outside ultimately. But yeah, what he did in the finals, as I've got in the profile here, 27 tackles in 2 Waffle Finals games. So there was interest mid-year, but after that, there's really going to be interest from clubs then. So yeah, certainly in the mix late or as a rookie potentially for a club. So a name to watch out for. Bulldogs, I've gone with a mature age field. Don't know if they're going to go for mature ages, but they're at this sort of stage where I'd imagine they'd be wanting to win now. They've just made a grand final. I think they'd be really looking to inject some immediate talent. So I've gone with Fedjo Jr. here, where he's almost that a couple of years older, sort of Wanganeen-Milera equivalent, almost, you could say. So perhaps if an Essendon were to miss out on Wanganeen-Milera early on, which they very well may, he could go before their pick, or maybe they pass on him for someone else. And Essendon could certainly consider him. But yeah, for the Bulldogs, look, he makes a bit of sense. They've got so many ball-winning mids. With a Fedjo Jr., it just introduces some excitement. Whether you've got him on a wing, play him forward, could even have him running off halfback. You've got a lot of options. So he's one of those talents where, look, you probably need to give him a year to sort of get used to the AFL standard, given he's really only been playing Sandful reserves for the most part. So yeah, he's certainly one where you should be aware of. And just if you want any convincing on him, look at some highlight tapes. I say that every time I talk about him, but yeah, gee, he's a highlight reel of a player to say the least. Just the way he moves is incredible, and he's got the good skills as well. So very exciting player. Has the ball on a string whenever he's got it. So he's a fun watch. So West Coast at 53 it is here. So Matthew Roberts, I think, could be a chance. So, and he's one where maybe he goes as high as the second round. I think he almost drops into the third round, into the latter part. Could even go as a rookie. So, although he was one where he would have been an absolute consensus top 10 pick at the start of the year, look, what he's done in the second half hasn't been as strong. Under 19 champs, disappointing. And look, what he was doing sort of forward wing at Sandford League level, like he was all right, but when he was a midfielder in the under 18s, he was so much better. He was that really top end pick. So I think West Coast, given they like their guys who really going back years have really performed, well, I think that's where a Roberts really makes a lot of sense. So they need that midfield boost. Roberts makes perfect sense here. So, but yeah, Roberts has been great for a number of years. Coming into the year, I had him top probably 5 I would have had, and probably for much of the year I would have had him around that region as well. So yeah, really good midfielder ultimately. But yeah, represents value late. Jackson Archer, North Melbourne father sons, they've nominated him. I can't imagine there'll be any bids. He's not that advanced or necessarily the most talented to really demand an earlier bid, but he's just a competitor ultimately, and I think that's probably what North Melbourne like about him. So that's why they would have nominated him. So, and look, they're a bit thin in defence as well, so it makes sense. But I would have let him go into the rookie draft and try and get him there if I'm keen on him. So Port Adelaide, so Jace Burgoyne. So there could be a bid coming a little bit earlier. So this is the son of Peter. And look, he's an interesting player. He's played a bit of midfield, bit across halfback. He reads the game well, marks pretty well. Probably hasn't been super convincing for me, but it's possible there's a bid, maybe 30 plus potentially for him. So there could be something in the 30 to 50 range potentially. So yeah, we'll have to see whether a bid comes. For the purposes of this draft, I've made it that there's no bid, but Port Adelaide should be prepared, and I'm sure will be for the possibility that there is a bid made for him. And Hugh Jackson, so he could go anywhere from the second round ultimately, and the way he started the season, I've mentioned it here in my profile. So 35 disposals or over for the first, or he averaged 35 disposals for the first 9 SANFL under 18 games. So, and that's what Tom Powell was doing last year. At that same level, he was getting 35 a game. So, and with the Jackson, he's a really skillful type as well. But a lot of that was down to, he was just a high usage type where he was really just looked at really almost on every offensive drive. So that's why he was finding so much of the footy at that level. So that is the one thing to be mindful of. But yeah, look, a bit like with a Roberts, look, his second half of the season wasn't as strong. It wasn't as convincing. So that's the thing to be mindful of there. And look, he's not the strongest contested ball winner, and he's been finding it more as he's played more around the ball, but I think he'll be more relegated to playing more an outside role for AFL purposes, maybe even across half forward a little bit too. So they're things to be aware of, but there's been interest from Adelaide, and if he makes it this far, that'd be over the moon, I'm sure. But yeah, he could be second rounder, so do keep that in mind. And then Gold Coast at 57. So, and of course, Gold Coast, they had to delist Hugh Greenwood and Rory Thompson just to create enough list spaces available so that they would be able to take 3 picks. So that's what happened there. I certainly query the choice to delist Hugh Greenwood. For me, he's one of Gold Coast's best ever midfielders based on, in terms of like what he's been doing in terms of the quality of his games. So yeah, I think that was really a silly one when they could have really cut someone else who isn't as good. And given he's someone as well where, as if I was a rival club, I'd be taking him in an instance. So credit to North Melbourne for that. But yeah, given Greenwood's gone and also Will Powers left through the trade period of Fremantle, I think maybe a Charlie Constable comes into consideration. So there's been a bit of talk around that move. So this being a phantom draft, of course, I'm predicting that this will be the case, even if he isn't necessarily the guy I would be taking in Gold Coast situation. And then, of course, I've got Rory Thompson being redrafted. Blake Slinslog, I've gone late to the Bulldogs. Again, I've gone a second mature ager, but the Bulldogs, look, they're thin in defence. They really need to improve their key defence stocks. And look, Tim O'Brien can help. He can intercept, and he showed some signs later in the season for Hawthorne. But yeah, look, ultimately with a Slinslog, I think he's possibly a better option than quite a few of the guys that the Dogs have. So I'd be pairing a Slinslog with Alex Keith, and you can even have Tim O'Brien in that same team. And I'd be feeling a lot more confident in the Bulldogs' defence. So, but yeah, in terms of what he was doing as an interceptor, how he reads it off the boot, Blake Slinslog is phenomenal. So, yeah, really, I'd be very happy picking him there if I was the Bulldogs, that's for sure. Particularly with Sam Skinner signing with Port Adelaide. I think there's value here. But in the case of a Geelong, look, they might be considering him potentially. So there are a few clubs that may have some interest also. And there's other key defenders as well. So we'll just have to sort of see. So you've got Pagario from WA, who could be one, where he's a 24-year-old key defender. Good athlete, good skills. Maybe he could come into the frame here. Maybe a Collingwood or someone else later in the draft consider him. So there's a few of those types around as well. And the last one, I've gone Corey Preston. So with the Corey Preston, he was on the radar in last year's draft, but of course with no NAB League season, look, it sort of didn't go ahead. That's why he got overlooked. Didn't really get to see enough of him for the recruiters to really justify, given he didn't play NAB League the year before. But yeah, look, with a Preston, yeah, I think really what he's done this year, how he established himself across halfbacks sort of later on in the Victorian campaign, I thought was really promising. So I think in the latter part of the draft, and there's been a few clubs that have expressed interest, Essendon, one of them. Yeah, I think a Preston could be a possible pick. So yeah, another name to watch out for. But again, there could be quite a number of extra names picked than I've gone here. But again, I've gone the minimalist model where I believe teams will really be wanting to maintain the list flexibility beyond the national draft, and they may even consider taking someone in the preseason draft, though that's unlikely, and more probable is that they'll go to the rookie draft, take the number of players they need to, and then they'll really want as much flexibility for the preseason supplemental period, but then also mid-season draft, you might have a few teams leaving spots open, or you'd have quite a number leaving spots open, particularly those that don't think they'll finish too high, I'd be expecting. So yeah, hopefully this is a good insight. And also for a quick update, so some of the things I've been doing for ESPN. So, of course, we've got the Phantom Draft here, which you've just seen. I'll leave the link in the description below for that. we've got here answering some of the biggest questions. So 10 of the key questions around this year's draft. I've got my final power rankings. So, of course, the phantom draft that I've just gone through is where I believe clubs will take guys. My power rankings, on the other hand, is purely and simply just where I personally rate players based on how good I think they'll be, basically, for their career. So, who I think will be the best player, ultimately, in what order. So here, the evolution of the key position player. So here I go into some deeper insight into, I guess, the evolution of key position players and how really everyone 200 centimetres and above, if they're talented, they're being developed as key position players rather than rucks. So that might be an interesting read for those that want to see, I guess, where I believe the AFL game will be moving in the future. I've gone through Geelong's mature age success and how I strongly believe, based on looking at drafts previous, really, I guess, how underutilized mature age recruitment is and how vital it is as well for clubs really to be scouring the state leagues closely. And I also go into the fact that in this piece that really, if you go back across however many years you like, it doesn't matter, you can pick the draft, every single year there is at least one, whether it's a mature ager, whether it's an overager, at least one every year that is a clear-cut top 15 player. That's what I found from my research. So that's something as well for YouTube I'd like to go a bit deeper into, because it's a thesis that not enough people have really bought into, and I believe it's really essential if you want to really get your power rankings right to really, I guess, cater towards that understanding and really include that quite a lot more. And here, of course, I've gone through the trade period, so analysing that. So really at this time of month, if you look through espn.com.au/AFL, you'll find my work everywhere, because ultimately I look at the trade and free agency period, but in particular my focus is the draft. So if you want a good amount of draft content that's different to what you're going to find anywhere else, well, you've got espn.com.au for that, and you've also, of course, got my YouTube channel here. So make sure you certainly check out all my other videos. And also, before I finish this video as well, I thought I'd let you guys know a little bit of an update of some of my future plans as to what I've got in the pipeline. So on espn.com.au, I'll be completing a review of the first round of the draft. So that'll be coming pretty much straight after the draft. So you'll get it the morning after. So that'll be on the Thursday morning after, of course, Wednesday's first round. And then the next day, of course, the next morning, you'll be waking up to my full review of the draft. So I'll be going through everything and giving out grades to all the clubs as well. So that's always a fun one and always stirs up some opinions there. But otherwise, down the pipeline a bit further, I've got my, it's going to be a look at the 2022 draft and some of the top players in that draft. So that's a good one if you want a bit more insight sort of looking into the future. And I'm also thinking as well for my YouTube channel about over the coming days, this will be following the draft, really looking at, I guess, this off season and looking at, well, what are the single best moves made? Or possibly I'll be looking into which are the teams that have really, I guess, done a lot towards getting better. So I'm thinking about something along those lines, though I'm willing to leave it to you guys in the comment section as well below to, I guess, give me some feedback on what are some of the things you'd like to see as well. Because of course I'll be doing my draft reviews on ESPN, so I'd like to do something that's a tiny bit different towards that, but possibly looking towards, I guess, the whole off-season broadly, looking at both the trade and free agency period and the draft. So I'm interested in some thoughts as well. But if you've got any draft questions, let me know in the comment section below. That's what I'm here for. I get back to everyone if you've got draft questions. So certainly don't hold back. But of course, on the night of the draft, it will be hard to get back to you guys on YouTube. So make sure you get back to me tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'll try and get back to you. And there's certainly times where I get the chance, at least, where I'll try and get back to as many of you as I can, and ideally all of you. So, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and like and hit the notification bell for future updates, and I'll see you guys in the next video.